Hello everyone, I am back once again with a new device to share with you all, and this time we're getting into sequencing. So I built this for myself originally. I've been jamming with a drummer friend of mine here in town, and I wanted a way to be able to manipulate sequences of notes in a way that works for me in a live context. So this sequencer, it's called Meridian, and it's largely inspired by the Euclidean algorithm. If you're not familiar with it, the algorithm was first described in Euclid's Elements hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but then the connection between that algorithm and musical rhythms was, I think, first made by a computer scientist named Gottfried Toussaint in a paper in 2005. So basically the idea of Euclidean is that you specify a length of time in steps and then an amount of notes or events, and the algorithm, it just tries to distribute those notes amongst the amount of steps as evenly as possible. It's a great way of building all sorts of rhythms, melodies, in ways that you might not naturally think to program or play them in yourself. And there's lots of Euclidean inspired sequencers out there. There's even one built into Live 12's MIDI tools. But I found that it wasn't working for me and the way I wanted to use it, so I built my own. And here we are, Meridian. One big difference between Meridian and the built-in Euclidean sequencer in Live is the way that it handles sequences of notes that are not in a typical 4/4 timing. For example, in the built-in Live implementation, if I set the steps to 5 and say the density or events to 4 and press generate, it will fill a 1-bar pattern like this. And so we can look at this. We can see here's 5 steps. And then it's saying, okay, I've got more room. Let's repeat those 5 steps. And then one more time, it's saying, let's repeat those 5 steps. And then it only has 1 step left in this 1-bar loop. So it just gives me the first step, the first event of that 5-step pattern. And then this is just going to repeat. So while I do have a 5-step pattern, it's not really looping in its own specified 5 steps. It's looping 3 times in 5 steps and then adding a step and then going back to 1. And that's fine and it works for many things, but I want the true polyrhythms where I want essentially the 5-step pattern to just loop like this forever. Meanwhile, maybe I have a 16-step pattern which is looping like this, and that means that these two different patterns are not going to share the first one step for, I think, 80 steps. And that to me is very interesting. It makes it truly polyrhythmic. And that's really one of the focuses I had when building this device. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyways, I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself because first I want to show you the device, the controls, what they do, what it can do. And then we will go back to this kind of what I'm talking about here, where the built-in Euclidean sequencer in Ableton is not quite the same as this device. So starting from the left of Meridian, we have 4 on and off buttons here. You can turn on each of the 4 tracks. To the right of that, we have a re-trigger button, and this does probably exactly what you would expect. It re-triggers the pattern, and it's kind of like a hardware-inspired feature where it can just be interesting to add different variations where you just re-trigger one of the patterns in an interesting way. But there's also kind of a useful use case for it that I'll mention a little later in the video. But moving along, next we have the place where we select a note, and then we set the amount of steps. And as you can see, these steps are represented here in the little visualization. Of course, the colored circles are events, and the dark gray ones are just the amount of steps. And then these little dots indicate that this is a pattern that is less than 16 steps. And then, yes, the next is the events, or the actual notes. And then we have rotation. And rotation is interesting because it just shifts everything to the right. And so again, this is really fun for live use because you can just slowly kind of evolve or change the feeling or the sound of a pattern. Then we have a random button, which does exactly what you would expect. It randomizes all the parameters to the left to just find interesting things on the fly. And that is the end of the first panel here. This is the Euclidean panel, really. It's the guts of the device. But then over here, we have some more generative options, and I will get into those as well. So the jam button is pretty much doing what the randomization button is doing, but it's doing it at a regular interval, which you actually set over here with the often control. So if I turn on jam, we can see that these notes, events, and steps are changing every quarter note. We can change this, make it every half note, or every bar. And then the notes button here is similar, but it just affects the note. The jam is really just affecting the events and the rotation. I opted not to affect the steps because I think you don't necessarily want to change that in a random way. You kind of want to be in control of that. So anyways, the notes is just going to affect the note at the same frequency specified here with the often dial. And this can really get into some pretty interesting generative things, which I will show you soon. And then we also have a low and high note selector here, so we can choose the range at which a random note will be selected. If we only want bass stuff, we'll put it down low. And if we only want high stuff, we'll put it up high. And then one more control, we have the velocity control. So when it's turned all the way down, all your notes are going to be the same velocity. And when it's turned all the way up, we're adding quite a bit of variation of velocity, which can make things sound more human, more natural. It's nice to have the option. So that is the gist of the controls you have. Of course, you have 4 copies of all these controls for 4 different tracks. And then we have some global controls here. So again, we have the visualizer, just so you can see what you're doing. Then below that, we have the subdivision, the global subdivision. I generally am using this with 16th notes, sometimes 8th notes, but I also have given you the option of going as slow as quarter notes, half notes, and 1 bar, which would make this a very, very slow sequence. But for some cases, maybe that's what you want. Then we have a couple more randomize buttons here. So this one will just randomize everything in the left panel here, the sequence, like so, coming up with happy accidents, trying new things. And then randomize jam is randomizing all the things over here, except actually turning these buttons on and off. So the way you would use it is you would say, I want this track to randomize, I want this track to randomize the notes, this one do both, this one do both, and then you would do randomize jam, and then you're going to see all these numbers change. Basically just playing around with different notes, trying to find new things, just looking for inspiration. That's what we're always doing. And then below here, we just have a preset panel. This is quite handy, I think, because you can have, different sequences, and it's quite easy to switch between them in a live context, or just save something you like for later, maybe a drum pattern you're really into, or whatever. It's there for you to use. And of course, you can shift click on an empty one of these white ones to save a new preset in. And that's the features of Meridian. So just to demonstrate what I'm talking about with the polyrhythms, we'll set 1 here. This is just going to be a classic 4 on the floor kick. Rotate can be off. And we'll start this. And then we'll turn on another one. We'll say a 5-step pattern with 3 events. And as you can see, they each have their own timing. The 5-step pattern is not controlled in any way by the 16-step pattern. So it's kind of playing at different times each time we hear the 16-step pattern. And what we end up with is beautiful polyrhythms. We'll throw in another one here, 11 steps. And then we'll throw in a snare on the 2 and the 4. And then maybe we can start playing around with the jam features. Maybe we'll start to play around with the notes as well. let's actually do this one. Set the range. And we'll do the same on this guy. Yeah, a lot of potential there for just not only for live performance use, but just for sometimes you're just looking for something new and different when you're sitting at your studio space, wherever that may be. And I think it can be quite inspiring to just see what you can come up with and kind of think outside of your usual processes for creating a rhythm. Another fun example is with melodic sounds. So I have a piano set up here. And with this setup, I've added the Ableton scale MIDI effect. And this way we can just kind of experiment freely without worrying about playing notes that don't fit in our key. So I've set it to C minor. And I have a stored pattern here that I quite like. I'll start with just one track and we will give it a play. And then we'll turn on the other tracks. And then we can start to play around with notes. We can turn off these random buttons when we find something we like, and maybe we'll store it to a new preset and then shift between them. I feel like I could listen to this generate ideas for me for a very long time. Cool. A couple little things I want to mention, kind of tips or things to keep in mind. One is when you are doing a bunch of randomization, each randomization that you trigger is going to be affecting the live undo history. This is kind of a caveat of Max for live devices. This is an issue with many of them. So for example, if I maybe it was just adjusting the volume or something and then did a bunch of randomizations, just randomized a bunch of things, and then I want to go undo my volume adjustment, I'm going to have to undo through all of those randomizations first. I mean, it makes sense because each one of these is an action where you're interacting with a dial. So just something to keep in mind if you're in the studio and you're using a lot of the randomization, or if you're letting it run, for example, when you don't need it running, you're sort of just filling up your undo history. So just something to keep in mind, be aware of. Another thing I wanted to mention is this retrigger button and what it can be used for. So say you're working in a pattern that has 11 steps, and while the transport is playing, you change it back to 16. While I put in a few fail-safes to try to figure out where the one should be when switching steps, occasionally it's going to not get confused, but just not line up where you maybe want it to. And one way to remedy this without stopping transport, say you're playing a show, you don't want to stop things, so you can actually just re-trigger and kind of nudge one or all pieces, all tracks, to a different position. And it actually can just be used for an interesting kind of rhythmic stutter effect as well. So just something to keep in mind. I think that is a pretty good overview of the device. I've really been enjoying playing around with this one. Like I said, I made it for my own kind of wants, and then it got to a point where I thought, yeah, I think this is something that I can share with people. I think this could be useful for more than just myself. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I appreciate you so much for even sticking around this far in the video. I am one guy. My name is Ian. I don't often introduce myself in the videos, but my name is Ian, and the company is called iJo Audio, just based on my name. It's just me here at iJo Audio, and I'm doing this so that I can work from home, so I can be around my toddler, be around my wife, be a happy little family. And I'm so appreciative to you all past customers, supporters, people who've shared music made with my devices, people who say nice things on YouTube. I appreciate you so much. I am so truly grateful to be here doing what I'm doing. So thank you again. Thank you for your time, for watching this video. I hope it provides you some inspiration. This device is available from my Gumroad store, as well as my new Ko-fi store. If you prefer to pay with PayPal, they offer that, as well as regular credit cards. I think that's all. If you have any questions, if you need information on anything, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. Hope you're having a lovely day, and peace.